Hi, I'm Mike Dilk, and you're listening to the Relax Back UK show, the show that explores all kinds of health topics relevant to you, your family, and your friends. Each week, I talk to expert guests from a range of backgrounds to inform and entertain you. So please do join the Relax Back UK family and stay tuned.
Hi, and thanks for joining me on the Relax Back UK show. The topic this week is digital health, and my guest is GP Nancy Allen, founder of GP Direct Online, and she explains how many of her patients are using wearable digital devices and how they provide her with useful information to help her treat them.
Younger people from the age, I would say, of 20 to 65 generally have some form of wearable smart detecting device, whether it's a smartwatch or smart ring.
So please do stay tuned for a great show. Thank you. So my guest is GP Nancy Allen, founder of GP Direct Online. And in my sort of normal everyday life, I see lots of people using digital wearables. I have one myself. But as a GP, I asked her how many of her patients come in wearing and using such things.
It's a really good question. We have been using digital wearable monitoring devices within healthcare since 1962 was the very first Holter monitor, which we used to detect cardiac arrhythmias or irregular heartbeats. So we're aware of it, we use it every day. And I would say since COVID particularly, there's been a general shift towards online consultation and digital healthcare. That's just enhanced video consulting, etc. But to answer your question, I would say everybody, very few, well, I think it's age related. The more older people over the age of 75, generally, I don't find them wearing smart watches or smart rings. But the younger people from the age, I would say, of 20 to 65 generally have some form of wearable smart detecting device, whether it's a smartwatch or smart ring, without mentioning any brands. But personally, I find they are fantastic, and I can tell you several reasons why and what monitoring, what data we can extract from these wearable devices.
Yeah, so well, tell us the stuff we can get that is useful as opposed to just kind of interesting for Joe Public. What's useful for you as a GP?
Well, there's a lot of data we can extract. So if we look at the data, we can, if somebody, for example, is wearing a smart ring, on that smart ring, which you can charge, I think, once a week, and sleep with it, we can monitor your oxygen saturations throughout the day. So that really helps if somebody, for example, has a chest infection, COVID or non-COVID or pneumonia. We had a bad winter last year, and it helps us monitor how low the saturation, the oxygen, blood oxygen saturations drop. And if somebody has that, we'll actually ask them, well, if your SATs drop, we call it SATs, oxygen saturations drop below, let's say, 95%, I'd want to know. So it's very, very helpful. And I would say to them, well, if it drops below that, let's have a conversation. And then based on that, we can make assessments and move forwards with a different treatment plan. So if somebody has the flu and they're wearing some sort of wearable smart device, whether it's a ring or a watch, and their SATs are at home, and they'll be told to isolate or just stay at home and are given advice. And the oxygen saturations would drop below 95%. Then I'd be really curious. I'd be sort of, well, we need to examine you and perhaps prescribe something further, particularly if they're wheezy as well. So that's oxygen saturations.
Okay. So let me just jump in there with a question. Well, remember the rest because I'm going to come back to them. But
Yes,
just for oxygen saturation, I mean, when you go to the hospital and they put this thing on your finger,
yes.
the impression I get is that that's quite a specialized piece of equipment. Do rings and watches, are they actually accurate enough?
Well, I would say it's better than nothing. So I wouldn't say, Mike, you'd be quite surprised. You can get one of those, we call them pulse oximeters, and that would give you a snapshot reading, and that you can get them on Amazon for up to, what, £7. which
Okay.
yeah, you can even get a child monitor. And I find a lot of my European patients in particular, they come in and they're already ahead of the games and they'll say to me, "Oh, I have one of these at home and this is what my child sats." And so, well, show me what you use. And they'll come up with a child monitor, oxygen pulse oximeter, which is fascinating. And I thought, thank you, that's very helpful. It gives me a really good idea. A lot of patients have anxiety about, when they would have had, if they've got a sickly child, they'll be up all night, give them Calpol and come in to see the doctor at 10 a.m. and the child is sat upright smiling back at me. And it's very hard for them to actually give a full image of how bad their night was. But if they've got readings on the pulse oximeter, particularly with children, so in the hospital, that's what we use. We use a pulse oximeter. But if somebody has a wearable pulse device that shows their oxygen saturation throughout the night, they're already way ahead of the
Right.
curve.
And you found these to be accurate enough, certainly, to give a good idea of what's going on.
Yes, I have no reason. Well, if they've got like a steady level, a constant reading, and you can see a sudden dip consistent with their symptoms, and if, for example, a patient talking to me, even on the phone, isn't able to complete their sentences because they're short of breath or they got a cough, add the two together, you get a really good picture of how bad they are, rather than, oh, I've had a bad night, doctor. I've had a bad night, and my SATs have dropped to 94%. That's a red flag for me. I'm like, okay, you're already ahead of the curve, and you've given a very good um, objective objective bit of data to the doctor stating that your stats have dropped to this level. That
Yeah.
immediately you're ahead of the.
Good. All right. Look, I interrupted you. You were going through lists of good information you can get. So that's oxygen levels.
Yes. So another one, which is a wearable device, I personally have a ring, which I don't wear, there's I think the original ring came out, was it 2019, right before COVID, and it cost, it's a lot of, a couple of hundred pounds. So I personally wear a non-branded ring that cost me like the price, £30 plus a few coffees. Um, and I was quite surprised. From that, you can also detect your blood pressure. That's an interesting one. So a lot of people come in, and blood pressure is a silent disease. A lot of people come in, have high blood pressure, and they're not aware of it for years and years until it could be too late. Um, or they have a random blood pressure test and they come in, it's 200 over 110. And they have no idea that they've had this silent disease brewing within them for years and years. Whereas if they were to wear a smart ring, for example, or a watch, a smartwatch, which detects the blood pressure and it's high, they can immediately come into the doctor rather than go into your. I'm like, how much time do you have in it? We all have very busy lives, and if something's isn't hurting you, what's the chance of you going to a pharmacist to check your blood pressure or going somewhere, taking a day out of, time out of your busy day to actively go and check your blood pressure?
I'm very familiar with this scenario because I am exactly that person. I'm reasonably fit, reasonably healthy. I'll go for the odd jog, what have you. And more or less by accident, I got my blood pressure tested, and the guy said, "You need to do something about this. This is too high. You just
Really?
like yeah,
Yes.
go see your GP kind of tomorrow." um, so this
Yeah,
was a couple of years ago. So yeah, I am very familiar with that scenario. It's worth being on top of this stuff.
absolutely. But generally, men are the least people to approach their doctor and come in with a health concern. For some reason, it's like, they just don't come into the doctor. If they come, they'll sit on the chair and say, my wife told me to come in and see you because of X, Y, and Z. Or there's always a reason why they'll come in, which is quite sad, unfortunately. They suffer in silence, and particularly if it's a silent condition where you don't feel anything. But if you're wearing a smart ring and you come into the doctor and you're able to download the data on your phone and just, here you go,
Mhm.
this is what my ring says I have.
Have you
Obviously,
had patients come in? with specifically with blood pressure and done that?
Not yet. I
Right,
would, but I can see that happening.
right. Okay,
And it's
good.
podcasts like this that's putting the information out there where there's a shift from us being quite reactionary in the NHS to people embracing their own health, monitoring and tracking their own biometric data, and coming in on the app and showing us on the app, here you go, doctor. This is what the ring has said my blood pressure's been. And I
Mm.
would immediately, okay, this is interesting. And it would be documented. And obviously, we would do our own standardized tests and etc. But you're already way in ahead of the game. And not only that, it would track it over like 3 or 4 weeks. So I've got really good information there to then act and start taking action upon.
Good. All right. So we've got oxygen levels, blood pressure, anything else that these things measure,
Yes.
which is useful?
Yes, so ECG, your heart rate is another really, really important indicator of a lot of diseases. So one would be mental health. So one of the first symptoms of anxiety is palpitations and what we would call in medical terms tachycardia, a very fast heart rate. So the average resting heart rate would be 70.
Hmm.
If you're super fit, your heart rate would be about, well, it depends on your fitness. So if you do a lot of cardiac workouts, your heart rate could lower down to even 52, have a resting heart rate. So the average heart rate would be 70. So when some people have a tachycardia due to mental health, they could just have a resting high heart rate. That would be showed on the on an app or on a wearable some monitor. So a high heart rate could be that. It could be due to hormonal imbalance, a high hyperactive thyroid. That could be also detected. So we would look at your hormonal profile if you had a high resting heart rate. And some cardiologists actually recommend certain wearable uh, data to track people's if they have an irregular heart rate, and they can track that. So some people have uh, not a consistently high heart rate, and they have certain irregularities which we can detect with different, more expensive devices, and they do have quite a good confidence ratio. So we'd be quite confident in the data on these wearable trackable
Right.
data devices. So your heart rate is really, really important. We can detect a lot of issues with a high heart rate. Sometimes with high blood pressure, you also get what we call a tachycardia, a high heart rate. So you need to monitor your heart rate as well. Your resting heart
Yeah.
rate is very, very
And
important.
and with all these things, when they come to see you and you measure them, that's just a snapshot. But if with these things, you can get continual measurement for a couple of weeks. Um, quite
The
different.
question I would put out there is why would you not do it? You're just ahead of the game. You're monitoring so much data, and you're coming in. It's objective. Here it is. This is what this is what has been detected, and I need to see you about this. What can I do?
Okay, so the data is there. Okay, we're talking an N of one at the moment. I'm talking to one GP, but you find this stuff extremely useful for individual patients to get a really good idea of where they are on some very basic data, which is important for all patients. Um,
About oxygen saturations, we talked about blood pressure, we've talked about your heart rate.
yeah.
You can also get your respiratory rate and some of them monitor your temperature as well. So that's very helpful. But a really, really exciting, juicy one is what we call CGMs, continuous glucose monitors.
Right.
So,
Tell us a bit more about those. Yeah.
well, I they're the ones that have been very heavily marketed. Um, They're very, very good for diabetic patients. In fact, the National Institute of Clinical Excellence, NICE, which is what we call it in short, recommends that diabetics need to be wearing CGMs, continuous glucose monitors, particularly insulin-dependent diabetics. And there are different types. There's ones that do intermittent readings, ones that do continuous readings. But I think it's a different story for people who are non-diabetic.
Mhm. Okay, actually, just describe a little bit the CGM, the actual piece of equipment, because this is a bit more than just a watch, isn't it? This is something that sticks into your skin or under your skin.
Yes, most people, I'm sure everybody's seen somebody wear like a little patch on the arm, on the arm over just beneath the deltoid
Kind of
muscle.
looks like a plaster, doesn't it?
It looks like a round circular plaster. It's about 2.5 centimeters in diameter. It's elevated. It's generally like cream in color. And I've seen the last time I was actually on a flight, I saw a lady wear one, and immediately I thought, she's probably diabetic. And that's what a CGM is. And they're very, very good for diabetics because they're linked and tracked directly to an app. And in a diabetes clinic, you can monitor what the average glucose rate has been. But there's been loads of, on YouTube, loads of social media posts about non-diabetics showing their glucose spike after a meal. But these are non-diabetic patients, and do I don't know how many non-diabetics invest in CGMs, but does it actually improve your weight loss, your longevity, your health outcomes wearing one? The answer is no. There's been research out there, but it hasn't proved any difference in your overall health outcomes wearing a CGM in a non-diabetic patients, even though there's been on the websites of a lot of glucose monitors. Unfortunately, they've put evidence and small research is proving that, but the peer-reviewed data doesn't support that. So non-diabetics, I don't actually recommend wearing a CGM.
All right. Because so does it just make people worry a little bit more about things they don't really need to worry about?
Absolutely. And the question is, what else are we going to be tracking that doesn't actually make any add any benefit to your health? Are we going to be tracking our electrolytes? Are we going to be, well, it isn't necessary if you're not diabetic because your body is already able to regulate your glucose intake. And your physiology is normal, so you don't actually have an issue there. Whereas in a diabetic, they're not able to regulate their glucose in a healthy manner. So it's a different story. So the answer is no. With non-diabetics, it doesn't actually add any long-term added benefits, even though it's exciting to see, oh, this has happened or whatever, but your body will regulate the glucose within 2 hours anyway.
I suppose people are naturally interested in what is happening to their own body, so that
Yeah, out of curiosity, yes, it's interesting, but I wouldn't necessarily recommend it if you're non-diabetic. It won't make a difference. You're not diabetic. That's it. Do you really need to monitor it? The answer is no. Another really important one, Mike, which is important, is sleep tracking, which is one again. Um, some people do have serious chronic insomnia. And for patients who don't have insomnia, I think your overall well-being, it's very, very important to have a good 8 hours sleep. And I would argue with unfortunately, there's a lot of like social media, and we live in a digital world where if you look at our ancestors back when we were in the cave, they didn't have bellies, they had more muscle. They were certainly fitter, and they didn't have any sort of digital things around them. They didn't monitor anything. They slept when it was dark. They woke up when it was light. They went out, hunted, gathered, etc. There weren't all these. There weren't ultra processed foods, and so people back in the day were much healthier. They died for different causes,
yeah,
but
they died a lot earlier.
yes, they probably did for other reasons, disease and etc. But if you look at countries where they have the highest amount of centurions, for example, Japan, they have the most simplistic life. I think they have 53 people per 1,000 who are centurions, and they don't have any wearable, trackable monitors or any digital influences in their life, and they live the most simplistic lives ever, and they incorporate walking into their daily life and just being active and having a sense of purpose. So I'm trying to give a balanced view that everything needs to be in balance. You don't have to track everything and monitor everything, but you have a more holistic overview of life and try and sleep more and just be more mindful.
Oh, okay. Interesting. I like that. Right. Let's move on a little bit because
Yes.
your experience, you're talking about as kind of as a single GP dealing with patients, finding some of these things very useful. Is there any sort of system in progress to enlarge the whole thing somehow within the NHS to help make the NHS sort of more efficient, run a bit more cheaply, and I suppose help more people more quickly by somehow gathering this kind of information via digital trackers and watches and rings and that sort of thing, just to formalize it all a bit
Well,
more?
I mean, I'm aware of a lot of the universities are doing a lot of studies with digital healthcare, but nothing has actually landed within my consulting room as yet.
Okay.
But we have, since COVID, definitely embraced more digital consultations, more access. There's the NHS app, and the NHS has, supporting people in trying to make digital consultations because sometimes you can't always ring up at 8 a.m. and get to see a doctor. Whereas if it's a non-urgent request, and there's video consultations as well. So, from the NHS side, we are going in that direction, but obviously it needs a lot of funding. And I think we are working more and trying to improve access more, but it does need funding. So
Right. Okay. So that'll be a discussion in a few months' time, a year's time or so. We can follow that one up then.
that's the story. Yes.
Okay. Something that does interest me is um, do these things really urge us? This is more of a general question, not necessarily a GP question, but I'll ask it anyway. Do these things really urge us to be more active? You know, because you can look at the amount of calories burnt, the amount of steps taken, that sort of thing. And obviously, everyone being more active is a good thing. Do you think they really do get us all to be a bit more active, or can it potentially work the other way?
I think it would induce a change in behavior. So if you're used to, like, to be honest, before I started wearing monitors to track my steps, for example, my working day would involve 10 hours sat at my desk. So I'd go in at 7:30. I wouldn't come home till after 7 p.m. So prior to wearing monitors, I would probably just do 3,000 steps a day, walking around in the consulting room, calling patients in, doing examinations, etc. But I realized, oh my God, I've only done 3,000 steps. I've got to try and get my 10,000 steps a day in.
Mhm.
Since I've started doing that, I've worked, well, how am I going to do this? So I'll wake up a bit earlier to get do a walk in the morning, and then perhaps a quick lunchtime, half-hour brisk walk. But since I've started tracking it, it has modified my behavior to get my 10,000 steps in. And I'll realize, well, if I only done X amount today during the daytime, then I'll make more of an effort when I come home to try and. So it has modified my behavior. So the answer is yes. Is there research to support that? The jury's still out. It's still very um, unequivocal. It hasn't actually
Sure.
proved that it has made a massive difference. But I think if people really want to modify their behavior and be more active, then it will start a behavioral change. And it's about adapting or changing your lifestyle, and it's more into preventative healthcare where you're more active, like our ancestors, where we're walking more. Whereas for example, in the 70s, people were less obese. At the moment in the UK, 75% of our population vary between being overweight and obese. So, and that part of that is the
That
fact
is a massive statistic, isn't it?
it's shocking. We are the fat people of Europe. It's quite.
And so, you're saying in the 70s that wasn't the case. Have you got a statistic for the 70s? You know, the percentage of people overweight or obese?
I don't actually have the actual numbers. I'd have to look that up. But just look at the old archives. If you go on, the old Facebook groups and etc., and look at people, the general population, even in America, just look at the people. Just they were flat bellies. There were no sort of the obesity statistics. But part of that isn't just lack of activity and we're not walking as much. It's ultra processed foods as well. They're quite addictive.
Yeah.
Uh, and we are consuming more calories that don't have nutritional benefit to our bodies, unfortunately. So more so,
That's another big topic that I might have to invite you back on because that's something that certainly interests me. But you're talking about the 70s. This is not ancient history. This is really just a few years ago, and there's been a big change in the population in those,
absolutely.
5 decades or something.
100%. It's a shame we haven't got anything to sort of like a probe you can put on food that sort of does a traffic light saying this is super ultra processed and it's a red, amber, green thing we can monitor. But generally, having more cleaner whole foods is a better way to contribute. And digital healthcare doesn't really help you with your decision making, but there are free apps out there where you can track your calorie intake. But I think it's so important to try and not have ultra processed foods. And it's the composition of food as well that's very, very important. And speaking of composition, which brings us on to the next subject regarding digital monitoring, is body composition assessment.
Okay. Yeah. Yeah. Tell us more.
So, so there are scales that, again, available online, quite affordable. It generally in the NHS, we tend to use something called your BMI. And we have something called a BMI above 25, you start becoming overweight. But the BMI, your body mass index, isn't actually a good indication of health because it doesn't look at your body composition.
Right.
The biggest um, risk factor for metabolic health or poor metabolic health is visceral fat. So I think it's so important to optimize your health and keep your visceral fat low. So you have different types of fat. We have subcutaneous fat under your skin, and we have that fat under your skin around the belly, but you have visceral fat, which is fat around your internal organs. And that is the stuff that is quite toxic. And that's the stuff that causes cardiovascular disease and it causes diabetes and it increases your incidence of having stroke and high blood pressure. That's this toxic stuff that people aren't able to measure, aren't aware of, that puts you
Right.
at.
So how do these fancy scales measure them?
Well, they release, I think, what is it? I'm not sure the exact type of waves that impedance, but it's called bioelectrical impedance analysis, BIA. So it's a scale where you can hold the metal pads.
Impedance. So it sounds like resistance.
Yes, impedance, and obviously fat has a different, so visceral fat has a different impedance to skeletal muscle to bones, and you can actually track all of this and try and monitor your visceral fat to bring that down to ideally it should be zero. So we can
So these
get.
things really do work, do they? Is it because I you know it I've trod on use these things and you have sort of two things that you hold with your hands very
Yes,
often.
yes.
Now,
Mhm.
if I'm being a bit negative, I say, well, surely this just measures how sweaty your fingers are. Because if your fingers are damp because you've got sweaty hands, then there'll be less resistance. So it'll. I don't really know how they work. I'm just been a bit
Um,
difficult, but
well,
no,
I
no.
mean, I suppose if you had sweaty hands, I'm not sure that, again, being a medic or science-based, has there been research studying if you've got sweaty hands or not? But I think the most important thing, would it change the reading by 1 or 2%? I think the most important data here is what is your percentage of body fat? which, if it's above 25%, you need to start looking at reducing your body fat.
Hmm.
Sarcopenia, which is a reduction in your muscle mass, which is linked directly to frailty and reduced mobility. You need to keep your muscle mass and monitor that as well, and your visceral fat. So I think it gives you more evidence of your overall health, and it has more benefits than not tracking and understanding. So how will you know how healthy you are and your body composition unless you actually measure it and understand, okay, this is what I need to do. And if you come up with a reading, and if you let's say you have a high visceral fat, then it might change your behavior in eating less processed foods and going to your doctor and just getting a health check. And you could get on the NHS a full hormone profile. You could look at your cholesterol, you could look at your liver enzymes, you could look at your fasting or non-fasting blood sugars. There's a lot of information, or something called HbA1c to check if you're diabetic and check your glucose regulation. There's a lot of information that you can gather and get a good free NHS health check if you know that your data based on this impedance reading is not ideal, not optimized.
Right, okay. So, right, there's an awful lot of information that these devices, digital devices, can gather, all very useful. One thing I was thinking about, if all this information is being collected for many people, you see lots of patients with these various different devices from different companies, this massive amount of information that's been collected and collated, where's it all going? Like, this could be quite useful. It could be useful for, I'm thinking potentially it could be useful for research, for the benefit of mankind, for people looking into all sorts of different things. Insurance companies would love to get their mitts on that. It would be kind of very useful for figuring out who they want to insure and who they don't for various different things. Are there any checks about this information? Positive and negative. Any thoughts on that?
It's quite scary when you put it like that, Mike. When you think of it, like, oh God.
It wasn't my plan to scare you.
Oh, it's a scary concept, that all are, it's like the Big Brother concept. There are pros and cons, I would say. The pros is if we collect more data points, we could become more healthier and give more personalized advice based on data. But then obviously when you sign up to one of these apps, they do the GDPR check and, the disclaimer, and you do consent to your data being put on the app and etc. So there are pros and cons to it. But I think overall, if it changes your behavior and you're tracking your biometric data, your body composition, and it sort of gives you a good baseline to improve your overall health, then that's a pro to it. But then are we being tracked in 20 years' time? Will we be all wearing some sort of tag? I don't know. The jury's out there. It's a scary concept. It's a bit like sci-fi. Where are we heading? What direction are we heading? I
Yeah.
don't. Quite debatable.
All right.
Interesting.
Maybe we'll park that just now and come back to something which is a bit more definite and less crystal ball gazing. For people listening right now, how can we use digital health to help the NHS or our care providers, whoever that might be, help us?
Well, I'll give you an example. I had a patient yesterday. He was in his 50s, and he's sort of had a midlife awakening, and he has started wearing this smart ring. And he came in to me and said, "Oh, look, my blood pressure's quite high." And he showed me the app, shared it with me. I had a look, and I thought, "Oh wow, it has indeed been quite high." And that's all he had to say. And he was ahead of the game. He walked out, had his blood tests, he had an arrangement to have our 7-day monitoring, blood pressure monitor, and he'll come back and see me next week, and we'll start him on the right track. So I would say that
You could have saved his life there, quite literally.
Well, he saved his own life, to be honest.
Okay, yeah.
It's a silent condition. How do you know how your health is unless you actually do these checks? So, is it easier to actually go online, get something delivered, probably same day or by tomorrow, start wearing it and monitoring things every day and then coming in to see your doctor when you're ahead of the game? This is what I found out. What are you going to do about it? And then the doctor just checks and without it's preventative medicine. So I always say, an ounce in prevention is better than a pound in cure. So if somebody comes in and they know what their oxygen saturations are, they know what their blood pressure is, they know what their resting heart rate is, and they know how much sleep they've had, they've added 10 years to their life just by tracking their baseline data.
Right, very good. Next question, final question, which is probably a little bit unfair, but I'll ask it anyway. We've touched on it a little bit.
Right.
In the next few months or the next couple of years, the future of this kind of stuff, where's it all going?
Well, giving it an intelligent, guess, I would say there'll be more monitoring, definitely. I think there will be definitely more health, but unless we start actually also scaling it back to what we're still humans, even though we've been on this planet for thousands and thousands of years, we still need 8 hours sleep. That hasn't changed. We still need to be mindful. We still need our basic necessities, and I think tracking it to a degree, but also living in a mindful state. And unfortunately, we've got more mental health conditions than we did back in the 60s and 70s. Is it due to more social media, more pressure, more AI? I think there needs to be a balance. And I think we need to have an overview of balance. I think in the medical arena, we are tracking more. And I think there's more of a cry for people to be more mindful of living a more simplistic life than, constantly on the go as we are. Like people are so busy working with this current sort of living crisis. People are working more hours, doing multiple jobs, doing longer hours, trying to keep up with things. But there's a health cost to doing that. And I would say living a more simple life is important as well to keep that balance.
Okay, that sounds like an excellent place to leave the discussion for now. But I would love to invite you back because there are a couple of things we didn't quite finish and things will develop. So I'd love to invite you back at some point. But for now, thank you so much for taking the time to chat.
It's a pleasure, and they're really interesting questions. And I hope everyone out there starts tracking their own biometric data, not for any other reason, even if it's just for a week, to know where you stand health-wise and just get a health check on the NHS. It's free, it doesn't cost a penny, and it's important just to see where your data is.
Excellent. Many thanks.
It's a pleasure. Take care.
Thank you very much to my guest on this week's show, and that was GP Nancy Allen. Thank you to you for listening. Please do remember to check out my book based on interviews with previous guests on the show. It's called Cut the Crap, Ask the Questions That Matter About Your Health, and have a healthy week. Until next week.
Thanks for listening to the Relax Back UK show. Join me, Mike Dilk, again next week for more fascinating interviews and chat. If you're listening to the podcast version, please subscribe, like, and share it with your family and friends. And have a healthy week. Until next week.